Let's jump to the beginning. Give us the one sentence focus of Spark Capital, and what the type of entrepreneur you love collaborating with the most.
So Spark manages about 1.3 billion actively right now out of two funds, an early stage fund and a growth fund. All that stuff you can read on the website. I think the harder thing to get across is most of our largest companies and most enduring and lasting companies over time have been in new markets. So I would say there are a lot of investors that are trying to catch the wave on some hot thing that just started this year. We tend to have a different type of track record, all the way back to Twitter and early social networking, cruise and self-driving, Oculus and virtual reality, with a long track record of being there just as the industry is forming. And so a lot of the skills that we build in partnering with founders is for folks who are building a new market versus trying to catch the wave of a current existing market.
And interesting enough, a lot of investors don't like investing in new markets, and they avoid that like the plague.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, going back to Don Valentine and Sequoia 50 years ago, it's market. It's this very market-focused centrality versus what we think of, which is very customer-centric, product-centric, design-centric, technology-centric. We use those as our guiding light.
So let's kind of step to the back a second to give a little context. And so serial entrepreneur, a couple different companies before becoming an investor. Tell us about what Conduit Labs, for example, one.
Sure.
And what was your biggest learning there through the roller coaster?
Yeah, Conduit's it's a great segue from what I just said, because Conduit was an early social gaming company. And I had previously started all new market companies. So Ambient Devices, which was a spin-out from the MIT Media Lab. We were trying to bring ambient and calm computing to the consumer. An early sports media company in the dot-com 90s. So when we started Conduit, there were no other social gaming companies. Zynga was not founded yet. Facebook did not have a feed yet. And what happened was we thought we were embarking on a new market opportunity. We felt like there was an emerging market opportunity that no one had seen before. And about 6 months into the business, it became a current market opportunity. Like Facebook released the feed, and it was a absolute tsunami wave of funding and startups and users and revenue, and it was insane. And I made a bunch of horrible decisions because I was attuned. I had spent 15 years building teams and companies and being attuned to what it felt like to build a new market. And this was a good example of where most of these startup manuals that aren't really manuals and advice you get and tweets and blog posts don't look at the nuance of exactly what the situation that the startup is in. And unfortunately, I did not have the DNA and experience to know how to navigate in that particular environment. I now do, and have several companies I work with that we very clearly delineate and have the conversation. Hey, this just became a different game. You need to think very, very differently because it's a different sport, right? Yeah, and so that was the big learning.
And so what was that, like, give the audience a feeling of what it was like the day before or a couple of days before that tsunami kind of started, because I'm sure it came pretty quick. And sometimes, but then you look back at it and say, well, maybe it didn't come that quick. But the feeling there of the transition from beating your head against the wall or telling everybody there's a new opportunity, and then all of a sudden there is this reality check.
Well, you touched on it perfectly, which is like you go from this world where you're spending the first bit of your pitch trying to inspire somebody to understand even what you're talking about. And you're doing a lot of like, it's X of Y. It's blah, blah, you're trying to set these more metaphors up so people understand. And in like the span of 30 days, suddenly you're speaking to investors and people you're trying to recruit, and they all know what it is because they all have just met with 4 of the people that are talking about it. And by the way, there's about to be a conference about it 4 months from now, and like it explodes. And so then it becomes about competitive dynamics. It becomes about what's your wedge and how do you grow quickly. And we would do things like set goals like, hey, we're at 100,000 users and we're going to drive really, really hard. At the end of the quarter, we're going to hit 1 million users, and it feels impossible. And then you hit it, and then you only wake up that next day and turn around and somebody else just hit 4 million users. And it's just a very, very different sport.
It reminds me when I was an entrepreneur as well, building Digital Railroad, when in 2004 I was trying to tell all the professional photographers and photo agencies that they were going to create digital files, sell digital files, and manage their images digital files. And they thought I was absolutely crazy.
Imagine that.
Absolutely crazy. Or when we started LDV Capital to invest in visual tech companies and deep technical teams, they said, oh, that's cute, niche, and science fiction. So things evolve, and so basically what you're saying is stick to your guns, figure out, what is that driver or what is that market opportunity? I mean, how would you explain?
I think the broader lesson is just that there are times in a company's life where the ground shifts underneath your feet. And it's not about you. The building of a company is not just about you and your product and the people that you get and your customers even. It's about the overall strategic world that you sit in. And there are just a few times in a company's life where everything just changes. And it's an example, by the way, of where having really good investors, I don't think there are that many very good counsels and investors, but a really good investor or a really good mentor or guider for you is a person who can sometimes just grab you by the scruff of the neck and be like, hey, everything you're doing was great and totally right 3 weeks ago, and it's now wrong. And it's not because of anything you did. And it's one of those, yeah.
So you sold Conduit.
Yeah.
And so any regrets?
No, we did exactly the right thing for the time. I sold it to Zynga, which was leading the market at the time. I had done a bunch of work to figure out who I felt like actually had the best game plan.
So it was a strategic plan to go speak to all the potential acquirers?
Yeah, we talked to all of them. The original plan was like, if I think I have a better plan than all of them and I walk away from that, now that ostensibly we didn't move fast enough for about a year, to be perfectly honest. And I went to talk to them, and it felt like Zynga had the best plan in the market. I felt like they were going to win, and this is a time when they're actually relatively equal with 6 others. And so I ended up joining, and I didn't feel like I had a better plan than what Mark was working on at the time, to be honest. And so I ended up joining them to try and build Zynga.
So that year when you didn't have that growth, I mean, what were you trying to do? What was not working? What do you, in retrospect, what do you look at of what could you have done differently? Or if there are people in the audience that are building their companies and they're kind of feeling that kind of in-between phase, what's your learning or advice?
I try to keep this in something that's like in short
Sure.
fireside chat versus really deep dive. But I think the overall metaphor I would have is that, especially for people that are scientifically minded, who are clever and have worked on something really deeply, you have this, and you're also an obsessed founder who is just thinking about the thing you're working on morning, noon, and night. You have a tendency to almost play chess, and often with yourself. You're trying to think 3 moves ahead. If I do this thing and this other thing happens in the market and so on and so forth, then this is how I'll wiggle through. You're playing all these things out day after day. And the key when you're no longer at a new market opportunity, but you are in one of these tsunami waves, blitz scaling opportunities, is that you can't. It's more like football. No one tries to figure out how they're going to score a touchdown when they're at their own 20-yard line. It is just first down. It is week after week, and it's very hard for somebody who's used to kind of high-level strategic thinking to be like, actually, the job now is to not be strategic. The job now is just run as quickly as possible. Learn what your competitors are doing very quickly, pronate to them, move to them. It's just different. It's not just that it's faster or slower. It's actually just a different way of thinking.
It's a totally different way of thinking.
Yeah.
But you got to, in order to be successful in that block and tackling or that aggressive focusing, you got to have probably that target, the strategic thinking at a high level, make the decision.
Yeah.
Right? And then spend the weeks or months doing that, right? Because you still need to have that, because sometimes I'm sure you see entrepreneurs that seem like they're going hustling and really block and tackling, but they might not clearly be going to one direction.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing there's a lot of really hard things about being a CEO, and I do think it's something it's almost untrainable in any other, there's no other real proxy for the job. And,
except for doing it.
Except for doing it. You just have to learn it. And most of the CEOs that we work with at Spark are first-time CEOs, not all, but really a vast majority of them are. And so we're used to that arc. And I think actually the hardest thing is the phrase I use with the founders I work with is finding your altitude. Because at any given day, you might need to be 1 inch away from your product, trying to find that last scientific breakthrough, or looking at the design of the logo, or doing things like I did in the middle of the night, like painting the office, like whatever you've got to do. And then sometimes it's really strategic, and you need to rethink your 5-year vision. And sometimes you need to be setting quarterly and yearly goals. And it can be very, it's maddening, actually, to kind of figure out which altitude you're supposed to be operating at that given time.
And then, so how'd you decide, what was the transition? And there was many other companies that you were co-founder, but let's jump into the investor side of things. And so that jump from being the serial entrepreneur to being an investor, what was the hardest part of that transition? Which I think I've read that you've mentioned a couple things that...
Yeah, look, I started my first company when I was 16, sold it when I was 18. I was in 5 startups as a various co-founder, whatever, before becoming a VC. I still have a bit of an identity crisis about this, to be perfectly honest, and still pretty much.
Why do you think I asked you on stage? I'm not gonna make it easy for you.
I still self-identify as a builder and an inventor, and I love. The thing I love about startups is the invention. It's that passion and love for putting something out into the world that will change it and that will bend the world just a little bit in a way that you believe. But I also found, and it was actually Bijan, who you know, and actually spoke here a couple years ago. So Bijan, who's a partner at Spark and has been a good friend for a long time, it was actually a conversation he had with me. So he basically knew me better than most and talked about how much satisfaction I got, not just out of the craft of building product, making the thing, but the craft of building the culture in a company and the craft of watching somebody go from being a first level engineer to a director of engineering to the VP of product to taking my job over, which is the arc of somebody that is still a good friend of mine that we did, and then ended up going out and co-founding a company. So I got so much satisfaction out of that. And his comment was like, I think as I've watched you over the last 5 years, more of your satisfaction is shifting there, and he was right. And this is the right job for that.
I think that's great. The challenge is, so as a doer, and I think I have similar challenges, or at least now investing for about 7 years. The first couple of years, and still once in a while, I struggle with, wait, let me just dig in and try to help you with that. And you want me to be the business dev person for 4 months, and you can't do that.
Has that changed over the 7 years a lot?
Absolutely. So I've gotten more comfortable with that and don't even contemplate it anymore because one is not the right long term for the company. It doesn't scale for me as a fund, and it's a negative for both. But the challenge was, because I was an entrepreneur for 18 years and a doer and like creating and very early, I wonder if you have similar challenges when you started investing.
I had the opposite problem.
Really?
I had the exact opposite problem. So you have to think, I've been an early stage entrepreneur for my whole life up until that point in time. And my experience with investors has been that they were either mostly, actually, I don't have a lot of horror stories, but mostly they're completely detached, had very little understanding of what my business was actually doing. I would come and present to them on how we're doing. They would show back up again 3 months later for the next board meeting. And I know that I could put up entirely different numbers from the last time we spoke, and they won't remember. I could literally just lie. They just don't even know. And so it was this very detached feeling.
Right.
Or usually, now there's this prevailing feeling that investors should be former operators. They can empathize with the founder and so on and so forth. My experience had been that people who were former CEOs, they felt like they could be CEO of the business, and they were there to tell some young buck how to run their company. And so I actually pronated way the opposite way. So I spent my first couple of years investing, I think, being way too passive, and just like, look, it's your company. It's you do whatever you need to do. I'm just here to support you. Give me a call if you need. I'm taking a lot of good notes so I don't forget what you said the last time,
right.
That kind of thing. But what that really absolved me of, which was really unfortunate, is that a really good relationship with an investor or any member of a company, anyone you're involved in the company, is one of vulnerability, where you can build a really high level of trust with that person, and you can be open with them and honest with them, and they will tell you the really hard things.
Right.
And so it kind of...
As a passive investor, or not as
You're not
involved,
doing that.
You're not that person.
And so I've gotten better at not, hopefully not intruding or telling people how to do the thing, but really having the difficult conversations that maybe nobody else is having with them.
What was the biggest nightmare experience as an entrepreneur with an investor?
I had an investor who was unhappy with the way that the executive team was interacting, actually throw a chair during a board meeting at the VP of engineering.
Oh my God!
And
did it hit?
Did it hit? No. There
was it just a signal?
There was some agility. Oh no! There was absolute. It 100% was an attempt to.
What did the guy say?
To stop the other person from speaking was actually the goal. That one was a good example. That was a former CEO, by the way, who was the person throwing the chair. Just so we're clear. That one sticks out of my brain.
Okay, and now on the investor side.
Yes.
What's the nightmare?
Don't throw chairs.
Okay.
No.
It's a good learning. So it could be with no names.
Oh, the biggest horror?
The horror now from the investor on the investor side.
So to be real, it's not. People say things like. It's saying no to a founder who wants to invest. That it's not that. I had to have a conversation with a CEO that I didn't think they should be CEO anymore. And it was somebody I had been, obviously won't go into it. It was somebody I had been working with for 3 or 4 years already. I had actually known them previously, probably a total of 6 or 7 years. We had backed them multiple times in previous rounds. And it wasn't even that the business was going upside down. The business had grown 3x year over year. Being a CEO is a skill, as we talked about, and it's a skill you really have to work on, especially it's first-time CEO. And what I noticed was that he didn't want the job. He wanted the title, but he didn't want the job.
Interesting.
He wasn't working on the skills to get better. Did he acknowledge
that, or is that part of the challenge?
Look, it's a really tough conversation, and so it took legitimately probably about a month to really get there. There's a lot of acknowledgement in the first 48 hours, yes, I hear you. And thankfully, we had a situation of very strong trust where I had been very straight with him and he'd been very straight with me. We had gotten to a place of vulnerability and trust that he didn't think I was doing, trying to take over the company or something. Like I was trying to do what was best for him and for the company. And but I felt also just disappointed in myself too. How did I fail this person? By not helping to guide them and get them to the right place. So that was not easy.
That's always a tough process. The learning from that, have you seen that crop up again where you're approaching it differently and from the learnings been able to avoid that or counter it in different ways? Because obviously I feel like I learn mostly from my mistakes, and the worst mistakes are the ones that still give me nightmares at night.
I'm actually trying not to learn from this mistake, which is very strange, but let me explain what I mean.
Sure.
That founder came in really raw, and it would be easy. The way you would learn from that mistake maybe is to say, well, I should just be careful about people that are coming in that are that inexperienced or that raw.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking about it that way. I was more thinking about it, it's going to happen. And then sometimes it's going to be the coaching part earlier.
Yeah,
is it different ways I would look at it if in situations.
But I was pretty active coaching there. Okay. It just didn't stick, and maybe obviously much like Thomas said earlier, obviously the answer, one of the answers is you probably knew earlier than you really brought it up, right. And you probably could have had the difficult conversation 6 to 9 months earlier.
I'm still trying to find somebody that has the answer of how to know when it's very.
I think it's the first. For me, it's the first bout of insomnia. That's my mental trigger. The first time you're laying down and you're this is just, I cannot get it out of my brain.
I'd call that the 4 o'clock club. You wake up exactly 4 a.m. no matter what time zone you're in. Yeah. In the middle of a dream, and that's when you have to make some changes.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk visual tech. We had a pre-summit interview, which I love one of your quotes that says, "Visual is an amazing lens to think through the world right now."
Yeah.
And you've got a couple direct and Spark portfolio companies that are in the visual tech space. You mentioned Cruise. There's Capella Space and North now. So tell us, what. Go back to before investing in visual tech, and is there thoughts on opportunities in this space that relate to your learnings in these for what's coming? What are the next opportunities?
I love the subject of visual tech as a conference. Can I just say I'm preaching to the choir here?
I'm biased. I appreciate you saying that on stage. Yeah. But go for it.
For both reasons. So by background, I self-taught computer science, but also went to art school. And very right brain, left brain person. And so, and if you look at Spark, actually, you could almost kind of split down the middle this right brain, left brain halves.
Bijan's very creative as well.
We have, I love photography as well. Yeah. I'm just not as good as Bijan, but I'm trying. And so, we have a lot of companies that are very focused on the kind of artistic and design visual side. And then, of course, we are also deeply in love with the machine learning, with computer vision as the new organ for the computer, the new input for the computer. Yeah. I think both are actually really fascinating. On the visual side, on the CV side, I don't think I'm going to say anything that you probably haven't said here for the last 2 or 3 or 4 years. The advances in computer vision are still woefully underapplied. I think the only thing I would say is, we're 25 years into the internet, more, and it still for me feels early. It still, for me, feels like there's a lot of new internet and especially in mobile companies that have yet to be invented.
Do you miss the sound of the modem that goes?
Yeah, I started early, so I definitely started with that.
Yeah.
But like I would just apply that same lens
Yeah.
to visual tech. Like I still, it is easy to look at the advances over the last couple of years and feel like everything is getting way more competitive. And I just feel like we're going to still have this conversation 10, 15, 20 years from now, and it'll still feel pretty early.
I fully agree. Yeah. And I didn't pay him, guys, to say that. This is all natural. So tell us about, when you did cruise and this topic you mentioned in the first couple minutes of this session, are you crazy?
Yeah.
And a statement that people sometimes make to entrepreneurs, frequently entrepreneurs, and also to investors. And some investors, if people say that, don't invest.
Right.
And some people typically more often invest when they say they're crazy.
Yeah, we definitely, as a group of humans, try and investors and partners for founders try and pronate to crazy and to risk.
That's where I am,
for sure.
If they don't say I'm crazy, then I'm.
Life is too short to not try, right? So Cruise, actually, Cruise was not about self-driving when we first had the conversation. The root of Cruise was actually the previous 12 months I had spent looking at new applications for computer vision. It literally came off the technology first.
Must have been one of your Twitter feed or something.
And it was probably just following you. And if you back up to this time, now there are dozens of companies with billion-dollar valuations that are trying to raise a bunch of money, and hundreds of others. I see some company on the autonomous space roughly every week at this point, if not more. Sure. But at that time period, it was really just the realm of academic research and then Waymo. So the most investors were in its big companies and academics, and Cruise was trying to do this as a tiny startup with seed funding, and I think what hit me about Kyle and Dan at the time was that
give us a date roughly.
I'm really bad at dates. This is probably 7 months into them founding, 2015, 14, something like that. They were more obsessed with the impact that the technology was going to have on the world than they were with the technology itself. And so they were technologists and scientists at heart, of course, but when you push hard on, what if this particular sensor doesn't work, or what if this particular approach doesn't work, they had a backup plan of a backup plan of a backup plan, and because it was more about the impact than it was about taking some interesting insight they had technically and trying to find a path to market for it. And you just got this sense of momentum that they were going to find some way to make it happen, like no matter what. And so actually we passed originally. I met with them, and I felt like the original pitch was to do autonomous driving, first do level 3 autonomous driving, so similar to kind of autopilot, cruise control, Tesla type stuff, and then eventually work their way up to fully autonomous driving. Right. And I spent a bunch of time with them, probably 10 hours, explaining why I felt like that as an aftermarket product sold into dealers was a terrible idea. But that doesn't mean you never have a relationship with the person anymore. And I was really compelled by them and what they were trying to bring to the world. So I just kept a relationship with them. And then they, about 6 or 9 months later...
All those discussions, were after the pass.
That was after the pass.
Right. So you kept on...
I passed, I went home, I spent like a whole weekend building a massive spreadsheet, trying to explain why the business model wouldn't work and kind of give it back to them and such, which I figured would mostly probably be just thrown into a trash bin. But I felt like I had to try because I really wanted them to win, whether I'm an investor or not.
Right.
And then they came back. They came back about 9 or 10. They went dark, back into stealth. They realized I was probably one of 5 people saying it. I'm not going to take credit for it. They went and figured out that that's not what they wanted to do. And they wanted to go all the way, full stack, fully autonomous, much more ambitious, much more risky, larger rounds over time. But it was the only path that felt like it was viable. And so the other ones felt like they were trying to placate investors who were seed investors or somebody else. And so, it didn't feel like them.
Try to get some initial revenue and try to do it a step better, but it might not be the right strategy.
It wasn't the right strategy. And so they came back, and then we invested a week later.
That quick?
Yep.
Because you already had done the due diligence, you already had a relationship.
Already had a relationship, already knew.
Okay. And so, there's an advice in there is when people, the entrepreneurs in the audience are fundraising, they're meeting folks, and there's a pass. One thing I always say is, no doesn't mean no, it just means not now.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
If you want something, and that true entrepreneur is going to keep on going. What is it going to take me to get you from a maybe to a yes?
Yeah.
And it might not be right for us to invest. It could be somebody else, but that kind of mentality.
I think it's especially true if you had a connection with the investor. Mm-hmm. If you felt like the investor got it. You're going to meet with lots of people who just don't get it. Like I think of starting a startup is like starting a new religion. Because frankly, most of the stuff inside of this thing is kind of not really true yet. That's why you're building it. So you got to have faith.
Right.
And so I think of it as like you're just trying to get believers. And so you might have a believer who happens to be a VC by title, but isn't putting money in. But you can sense it. You can smell it. It's in the room. You have a connection. They're just not going to invest. If they're a believer, if you've kind of got them halfway there, then you keep the relationship. Mm-hmm. If they happen to have some fancy logo or brand name of a firm that you like, but it's clearly not a connection and they're not going to be a believer, just don't waste your time.
I agree.
It's all about collecting people who believe.
Let's talk Capella. Tell us about Capella Space and how you got, why, and kind of what they're doing now.
That one was not based on any prior research, unlike the cruise situation. They do synthetic aperture radar, and basically at wavelengths where if you are trying to, it's basically the trying to fix what Planet Lab created. So Planet Labs, a small sat company, and launch a constellation of small satellites around the Earth. They take pictures of the globe. They give you a new piece of visual data, which is hourly. Ideally, it's fully realized vision, hourly data around the globe.
And how many satellites do they need to put up to get that first?
For Capella, it's going to be 16.
Okay.
Way less than some of the other technologies. The biggest benefit, so the problem with visual data, so using RGB data to try and take these pictures, is that, well, first of all, it's around the globe. That means half the time it's nighttime. So you're not getting any data during that time period. And then it turns out that there's this thing called clouds that cameras have a really hard time going through.
And trees and a bunch of other things that you can't see through.
Yeah.
Right.
And so synthetic aperture radar is ostensibly the solution for that. I'm kind of compressing a little bit here. But it's ostensibly the way to solve for that. Only it is not, Planet Labs and other small sat companies were basically peace dividends from the smartphone wars, right? You had these camera companies that have found a way to get smartphone cameras down smaller and cheaper, and that's great. And you're like, oh, I can buy those, like literally off the shelf in China, toss them in a small sat, throw it up in the air. That had not happened.
Can you actually really do that?
Yeah.
I can actually, I could.
Yeah, not toss, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like $1 million.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, it depends how much $1 million is tossed to you. That's really. All right. SAR had not gone through this process. So SAR was still in a process where if you want to put a SAR satellite up into space, it's a $750 million endeavor just to build the satellite and then try and get it up into space. And so it was really just one of those things where the technology was super interesting, but the more compelling piece was trying to imagine a world where that existed and the product application, what you get from that.
Yeah, what do you get from that? Different visual data and coverage.
Yeah.
And so what's the answer?
Well, the answer is you get perfect tracking of all the pirate ships around the world that turn off all their beacons. So you know where all the illicit goods are going around the world, which is pretty crazy. You get tracking of things like. Without going too deep in the technology, you can measure, because it's wavelength measuring and it's an active sensor. You can measure in z-axis, not just x-y. So you get you can measure tiny deformations, things like footprints going through a forest.
Cool.
To sense where people are going.
Are they going to help deliver one of my things that I've wanted for years, which is the satellite selfie?
No, they're not very good at. No, they're not, because it's not. The spectrum they're operating in is you're going to be.
Different. Yeah. But I still can't wait for that, because we can go out front, or even the radar could go through exactly, and there'll be so many satellites.
Yeah.
You'll get any angle and any f-stop for those photographers in the audience.
That's right.
You can get any angle and anybody. Yeah. Because they'll be.
Interestingly, SAR can't see people.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, you don't radiate back. So it sees a lot of other things, but not people.
Okay. So let's talk about, building startups takes a long time.
Yeah, for sure.
And so, how do you look, when you make an investment at Spark, obviously it's early stage. Frequently it's there, give us a little bit of what's the traction, typical, where are the people at when you want to meet them, and likely when you're going to invest, because that spectrum of would you do a person and an idea with nothing else?
So that's probably the area where we have a hardest problem. And it's because, if every investor wants to invest in a really amazing market with a beautiful, great founder, compelling founder who has an amazing product and a wonderful business model, you can go down the list. One of the things I used to do as a founder when I was going out to raise and got to know VCs, because one of the things is I failed to fundraise early on that I realized was that fundraising was actually just a skill that was endemic to the job that I need to get really good at. Right. So I just spent time getting really good at it. And I would start to learn, for this particular investor, did they measure the founder more than the product, more than the business model? Are these guys busy business model focused? Kind of stack rank order all these things that you kind of know in your head they care about, but don't really take the time to empathize with what the investor is looking at. So for us, product is first.
Right.
It's not market, because again, we're often very early in markets where you cannot measure them. Right. It's product. And it is like, does this thing really?
It's people first and then product.
No, it's not. I mean, the right tagline would be to say it's people first instead of product. That would be the marketing message. Yeah, but the real truth is, because the reason it's not people first is because that's how you get charlatans. People first, if that's really your only pronation, then the problem I have with that is that that's the best pitchmeister in the room wins. And so we use product as the true north to figure out
of the people.
And we don't, it's not just product, is this better? A lot of the questions are exactly what you're getting to. Why did you make that decision? Why did you build the product in that way? Why did you decide to do this? And you're trying to get inside of that team's head, so the decisions they're making.
Right. Okay, so when you say product, define product, because everybody's definition of product, where is a prototype product, a product that actually has customers, or a product that's working? Is there any?
Prototypes are great. When we invested in Control Labs, it was marginally working. The live demo took an extra 20 minutes to set up because it went down. Lots of wires everywhere and terrible. When we invested in Cruise, I almost died on the test drive. It was all over the place. It's something. We don't have to have a graph going up and to the right to invest, but we do have to have something you can kind of feel and kind of almost use as a talisman to have the conversation with the founder about the choices that they've made. And it's from that, we also offer operate a growth fund. So it's from that all the way up through traction and real growth.
And so back to this your analysis when you're an entrepreneur of the different investors and what they focused on. Give the audience a little bit of advice, because I know that from the entrepreneur side. I did the same as you, and it's the most frustrating thing in the world because everybody has different things that are important to them, meaning functioning prototype, traction, definition of traction is different. But doing that almost in a systematic way was the only way that I could figure it out, but everybody has a different system. And so would you have any advice, or your companies when they're about to go fundraising again, they might be later stage,
right,
or what's the guidance on the best way to have a successful fundraising?
So yeah, it's important for context to understand, of course, we invest relatively early in the life cycle. So I spend more time helping a founder raise their next rounds than it is the rounds they've had before they come to us. And usually what I try to do, and if it's, if you don't have an investor that has this context, or you don't have an investor yet, it's finding people in the peer network that can help you do this. The key is always just low, I can use the altitude analogy, lowering your altitude when it comes to investors. You don't need generic startup advice, like I'm doing right now. What you really need is somebody who says, hey, I'm going in to pitch Spark next week. I'm talking to these 3 people. I'm going in to pitch you next week. I'm talking to this person. Mm-hmm. What is it they care about? Right. What do they hate? What's the third rail you should not touch? Like, that's what's going to help you understand how to connect with that person.
I agree. The challenge also is they should do it for 50 people or 80 people and hope they get one. And that's one of the biggest challenges. Unfortunately, as an entrepreneur and investor, helping our portfolio companies, we've talked to 20. And it's like, well, you should talk to a couple hundred.
Yeah.
And hopefully you won't have to talk to all of them, but plan to.
Yeah, especially at the very early stages.
Especially the very early stages.
But there's a fine balance there, though. Like, I'll push back some, which is like, it can't just be shotgun. What I've also...
I totally agree. But with your methodology before, of the ones that are likely to invest in robotics, that are likely to invest at this stage, that we have this traction, that we have 10 other signals, and you're going to have a spreadsheet that has a group of top-tier first targets, second targets, third targets.
The first targets, the trick I used to do with the first targets, by the way, like the last time I fundraised, I got a seed round done, 4 people in a PowerPoint, in like, I don't know, a couple of weeks. And that's the short version of that story.
Well, that was later in your stages when you knew everybody and it was a little easier.
Although I was pivoting markets and the people I raised from were not people I knew before.
Interesting. Okay.
So it was 2 weeks from me, presenting a deck to people for the first time. But what it was really was a lot of market knowledge. It was figuring out exactly who the right people who are most likely going to invest in this market sector at this stage and so on and so forth. And then before going to meet that partner, meeting with a lot of the people that I know that they relied on for their market feedback and pitching them first. So that by the time I met with that partner, they were like, oh, this seems interesting. And then they called somebody up and they were like, have you ever heard of this, Nabeel person? And I was operating in games for the very first time for Conduit. And so I was really nervous, actually. I had a lot of imposter syndrome that I was doing this thing in games where there's tons of veterans and I have never operated in this sector before. But guess what? That partner called the 2 people in games they knew, and those 2 people knew me. A lot of people in games didn't.
Right.
But those 2 people did because I had taken the time and energy to make sure I met with them the week prior.
Exactly, to plan ahead for that, right?
Yeah.
So, and I agree with that, advice. So what % of the entrepreneurs that you meet for the first time have done their research?
Almost none.
Okay, so why is that? And I suggest bring this up because it's a context I have, and it's advice. If you're hearing advice from Nabeel and or others that do the homework, the more educated you are in the beginning, it's really valuable before that. But I agree with Nabeel that the majority of people that present to us for the first time have not looked at our website, have not looked anywhere and found out any information about us. Unfortunately, FYI, that's a negative signal, which could be overcome, but it's a negative signal.
I think it's, look, raising money's not an easy process,
Agreed.
and especially when it drags on and you're in year 2 of doing it, like has happened to me before, and it feels like it's this constant thing. I think the fundamental first principle, without kind of, if I were to try to condense down and only give like one piece instead of, because it's really 5, 6 different things.
Sure.
But if it's one thing, it's that I think many founders approach fundraising like it's a distraction from their company.
Yeah.
And the difference between being an academic researcher or being a product person, hobbyist, and being a CEO is that you're a CEO. And being a CEO means that you have to be skilled at other things other than just building your company, just building your product. And that means that I always thought of fundraising as like it's an essential and important skill to this business. If you can't inspire people in a room, then it's very, very hard to recruit top-level talent, get investors involved, which you're going to have to do over and over again through the life of the business. And so I think the first principal problem is that the kind of like feeling, this like internal feeling, is that fundraising is a distraction. And so you want to spend as little time with it as possible, get it done so you can, quote unquote, get back to work, instead of really viewing it as the work. It's important work. It's easier to get a divorce than it is to get rid of a board member who's an investor. So you might as well take your time and energy to be really, really sure that this is the person that you want to work with and have done the research ahead of time to move them to your side of the table.
Right. Okay, a couple questions from the audience. I have many more questions, but we're going to also transition shortly to our next great panel, moderated by Jesse, who's here, and Hadley, and everybody else who's ready. Who's got questions? They're in the back. Oh, I love these guys. Our high school crew.
So when you start fundraising, what kind of people do you reach out to?
Can you tell everybody what school you're at and how old you are?
My name is Agil. Some of you may have met me already. I go to Comp Sci High. I'm 14 right now. And yeah.
And what was the question?
My question is, when you start to fundraise, what are the kinds of people do you listen to, like the demographic?
So the first time I raised funds was when I was 17 years old. And the answer then was anybody that would listen to me, and hopefully people with a pocketbook. That ended up being friends and families, uncles and aunts and so on. I think that that is still true today in a way, which is that you're trying to find people that have both the means to invest, but also are already they have to have something in their life that would lead them to invest already. And you mentioned earlier, like, oh, does that investor invest in robotics already and some of that research? It is almost impossible to grab somebody who hasn't had some life experience or something that has happened to them that would make them interested in your idea. So I think you're searching for those kinds of people who would have a connection to this problem I'm trying to solve in the world.
One more question from anybody? Okay, another one from the high school crew. I love inspiring these young crowd.
So how did you find your product? Like, what inspired you for you to find this product?
I think, look, I started 4 companies. I've invested in, I'm on the board of 9 companies. And through Spark, we're in 100+ companies. There's no one answer. The fight as you get older is just staying curious. The fight every year is to just keep thinking like a beginner and keep staying optimistic. And I happen to be pretty much very, very optimistic. And so I think staying optimistic and still feeling like there's something else right around the corner and being curious is the kind of like the thing that opens that opens the aperture and allows for inspiration. I don't think you can force it. And I don't think you can say, I want to start a company, and so next week I'm going to go think about it and come up with a company. I think you just have to create the opportunity for serendipity.
2 last questions, which my favorite ending questions. In one sentence, advice for the very technical folks in the audiences that want to build a business. What's the one advice that you would give them?
I think we hit it, which is like, view the job of CEO as a dozen new skills that you have to relish learning. Okay,
cool. And your favorite personality trait and least favorite personality trait of entrepreneurs in 1-word answers?
Favorite is curiosity or passion.
Okay.
Fear.
Fear is your dislike.
Yeah, I think it's the killer.
All right. Round of applause for Nabeel. Thank you very much. This has been great. Thank you very much for being.